Welcome back to the Writers Craft Summit. In this session, I'm speaking with Elisa Douchette. Welcome to the summit.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about the things we were going to talk about.
Me too, because we are going to dig in the concept of copywork. And I think this is so useful because we all know it takes practice to get good at something, but it's not always clear to a writer how they can have a focused practice other than just writing. And so I think this topic is so great because it gives people a specific thing that they can do to get better at their craft other than just go write some more.
Right, exactly. Well, and it's such an interesting thing with copywork. We don't use it as much anymore in the way that we learn writing. But for the longest time, I mean, back to Buddhist monks and ancient Greek philosophers and everything, we learned by copying the words of other people, whether they were speaking them and we were taking them down in notes, or, flat out taking the literature that someone else had written and copying it onto our little, stone slabs in the one-room classrooms in the 1800s. Here in the Americas. Like, that is how we learned, and it's how the beautiful great period of literature that everyone likes to talk about from like the 1700s to the 1950s, that's how those people were learning to write the way that they did.
So for people who haven't heard of this concept yet, let's break it down for them. Like, what is copywork?
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing. I always jump in because I assume that copywork is kind of self-explanatory, but it's totally not. It is after you learn what it is, you kind of go, oh, duh, like I could have figured that out. But leading up to it, it's basically taking any sort of excerpt or piece of literature, essay, something like that, maybe even a speech, like I was saying, in ancient Greek philosophy times, the students would always copy down what the teachers were saying verbatim, because that was part of their job, was to make sure there was written documentation of these oratory speeches that people were giving. And so you literally take these pieces of paper, or whatever you're reading, get out your own notebook, your own piece of paper yourself. I highly recommend doing it by hand. You can type it, but you lose a lot of the comprehension. We could talk in a little bit, but you actually engage different parts of your brain when you write something by hand. So you learn more, and you legitimately just copy the exact writing that you're reading by hand onto this piece of paper. And it's kind of, I joke that it's like Miyagi in the Karate Kid.
So a little wash on, wash off.
Like, you're basically, painting the fence and wax on, wax off, and getting really irritated because you don't think you're learning anything. You're like, I'm just sitting here copying stuff. And then before you know it, just something clicks and you realize, oh, I've actually learned all of this nuance of writing and literature and storytelling and tone and voice and style and everything. And I didn't even realize I was doing it as I went.
How did you first get into copywork? How did it come into your world?
Honestly, the first time I kind of heard about it and found out about it was when I was a lot younger. It was like Laura Ingalls Wilder and Little House on the Prairie.
Yeah.
That's how she writes about learning writing, is that they would take books and stuff. And that's why I always make the comment of writing on the slate and stone slabs in the one-room classroom, because that's what she talks about for how she learned writing in those little one-room schoolhouses and everything else. Because additionally, back then, books weren't as prolifically available as they are now. So very often you would just have, a piece of writing that everyone had to gather around and try to copy and try to learn from, as opposed to a teacher standing up and trying to talk about that stuff. And I had kind of forgotten about it a little bit. And then I was reading Stephen King's book on writing. And he talks about when he was 5 or 6 years old, the first novels that he ever wrote were copying by hand the like dime store horror novels and, 10-page comic books and things like that he really loved reading as a kid. Because he figured if he could write like these books that he loved, then he could become a writer. And so he would just sit down and copy them so that he could, write those books. Because, of course, when you're 5 or 6 years old, you think intelligently like that rather than us being adults and being all, that's not writing. You can't write a book that way. You're not actually writing those books. He's just, yeah, I want to write that book. I'll just write it.
So you mentioned Stephen King talking about it. I think how I first heard about it was Hunter S. Thompson. I'm a huge fan of his work, and I know he did Copywork as well. And so maybe can you dig into that? Do you know some other famous authors that people might be familiar with who have done this work?
Now I'm going to be like, if I could have like loaded my, a page that I have that has all that reference point, I would have been much smarter. Hunter S. Thompson famously copied A Farewell to Arms because he wanted to feel what it was like, because he was Hunter S. Thompson and like, and so he wanted to feel what it was like to write a great American novel. So he copied A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway by hand. Which coincidentally, Ernest Hemingway used to do a similar thing because he had a very journalistic staccato writing style from his years being a field reporter. And so he knew that when he started writing novels, he needed to kind of get away from that a little bit. So he would copy down like articles and essays and writing from his friends all, in the left bank over in Paris. When he really resonated with something they were saying or a style or a tone, so that he could kind of start absorbing some of the changes that he needed to make to his very journalistic styles and standpoints. There's so many others who have done the same. Like I said, it's often quoted a lot, like Buddhist monks. They would get the teachings and the learnings, and they actually would sit down and write the aphorisms from the senior monks. That's part of your monastic training. I'm told, I've never been in monastic training, but that's part of what they do, is actually just copy down those learnings and teachings so that they can kind of absorb it themselves, both by the physicality of it and the mentality of reading it. There's just been so many people in history.
You mentioned, you alluded to some cognitive like science going on here. This idea that we actually learn better when we write by hand. Could you dig in a little bit deeper? That sounds so interesting.
It is. It's very interesting to me. I like geeking out about this kind of stuff. So basically, when you're writing by hand, it's a weird thing because you would think typing, you're basically, at the keyboard moving your fingers like this. So there's a physicality, but there's also a disconnect that happens in our brains when we're just typing words onto a screen. It might be like they're not 100% sure why there's the two cognitions between these two physical actions, thinking it's something to do with the screen and the fact that we're trained to type so quickly. When you're writing by hand, you engage that physicality again. So I'm not sure where it is in the brain, like neuroscience people.
Over here somewhere.
Right. Like,
around this general area.
Let's just pretend it's basically your brain is swirling up here from words and reading and comprehension. And then when you bring in the writing, like all of a sudden you start swinging in this part of the brain. Neuroscience people, I'm really sorry right now. It basically kind of engages two centers of the brain, which makes your cognition and everything that's happening engage that much more, because it's basically, there's a lot more, electricity firing between the different brain cells and things like that. There's more going on. And when you write by hand, you inevitably have to go much slower than you would typing. So as you're going through and writing it, you actually are slowing yourself down merely by the physical constraint of writing by hand, which means you read slower, which means you comprehend what you're reading more instead of just kind of glazing over it as you're quickly trying to copy it from one medium to another.
It's so interesting that clicked in my mind right before you said it. And just as you were speaking there, I thought, wow, you would experience a novel completely differently because you would slow down. Normally, you know, especially a novel that we love, you're tearing through it, right? You're like, I can't get to the next page fast enough. And so that idea of really slowing it down, you would, I'm sure, notice things you would never notice otherwise.
Exactly. And it also gives you the opportunity when we're typing and, you know, whether it's actually doing the copy work or writing ourselves. I actually have gotten in the habit after I started researching and learning more about copywriting. I handwrite almost all of my first drafts, all of my sales pages, everything else now, because there's also the reality that sometimes once we're into this habit of like, must get writing, must hit deadline, must be done, we speed up the process and we don't allow ourselves to stop and think about what we're writing and what we're doing as much. And so in doing the slowdown with your writing it by hand, you're able to actually stop as well and think like, oh, that's really cool the way that, you know, she just wrote this particular section. I want to go back and like reread it again a couple times to figure out what I really liked about it. As opposed to when you're typing, your brain is just on end result. You just want to get to the end of the page and go. Because that's kind of the way that we're trained when we're using computers and systems, is focused on the end, wherein when we're writing by hand, it's a lot more internal, a lot more reflective process.
There's this dialogue around the concept introduced in Malcolm Gladwell's, I think, is it Outliers, where he talks about the 10,000 hours?
10,000 hours, yep.
Right?
I think it's Outliers, yeah.
And then there's this discussion around that saying, well, it's not like you can just go do the thing for $10,000. It's focused practice for 10,000 hours, right? And so that's what I love about this idea of copywork and slowing things down, understanding the writing in a different method. Is it's that focused practice that actually gets you better.
It is. And that is, I think, the thing that we sometimes lose as we get, again, caught up in the deadlines and the end goal. Like, we all want to hit publish. We all want to get that like jolt of social media accomplishment. We all want that kind of stuff. Instead of taking the time to really kick it back and like, obviously you don't have to make it perfect. I'm very anti-perfectionism when it comes to writing and that sort of thing. I'm more so like, done is better than perfect, but like, better is better than done.
You know, I have interviewed probably 50 or 100 writing coaches, writing instructors. I've never met any of them who were like, I want perfectionism out of my client. Right?
So everyone who has been writing for a while, we're all like, oh, honey, that's adorable. You think you're going to write something perfect. Like,
exactly.
My heart bleeds for you and also swoons a little bit.
Well, let's talk about those writers for a moment, actually. What about those writers out there who think, oh, I'm going to lose my voice. I'm going to lose my unique message if I start copying someone else's work. I mean, I've even heard people, you know, these are amateurs, but I've heard amateurs say, you know, I'm writing a vampire novel, and so I've sworn off all other vampire novels because I'm scared it'll influence my, like, to me, that's what the complete opposite of what I think they should do. I'm like, I want you reading nothing but vampire novels. Writing one, like, learn.
Read them, watch the TV shows, the movies, the everything. That is your world now.
Exactly. So tell me about that. What about that fear? And what would you say to someone who's going to lose their voice?
Well, I will say, first of all, I can't recall a couple of the people I've seen off the top of my head, but it's not just amateurs who say that, which is where I think even more of the confusion comes in. I've seen professional writers who get, like, that's part of their process, and, you know, good on them and whatnot, but they kind of get into this place where they're like, oh, I just can't absorb any other things in any sort of genre or anything else when I'm creating, because then it influences too much what I'm working on. which I think is one of the most ridiculous statements ever, that you can't be influenced by things outside of what your own vision is. And I think that's actually a really dangerous thing for a lot of writers. And what we get stuck in is that we have a very set vision and a very passionate love affair with what we're writing and the concept that we're trying to relay and things like that. And so that's where we end up in this place where we're afraid to kill our darlings and afraid to like go off script and afraid to be influenced by all these other things because it changes what we were working on. And yes, sometimes you get influenced and you realize like, oh, that was a bad influence. Like I was trying to make this something that it wasn't. But also very frequently we get influenced in a way that makes it better. To be truthful, honest, in like a decade of editing and coaching writers, I can name maybe a handful of times that I have worked with a writer that got influenced by something and their work suffered for it. More often than not, it has always been as soon as you get influenced by something else, as soon as you like are intrigued by a new style or a new voice or a new tone or learn something new about the story that you're writing, it always makes it better because you aren't that person. Like you aren't that writer. You don't have their experience. You don't have their nuance. You don't have that voice and that style. So even if you get influenced by them, even if you come under their gypsy spell of like whatever great thing they've done, you're still going to be the one to execute it. So when you execute it, it's going to be, yes, maybe a little bit more in their style, but it's still you.
And I think one of the great things about Copywork is you're choosing your influences wisely, ideally. And so, I mean, you like when we mentioned Hunter S. Thompson, copying A Farewell to Arms, right? Like, you don't think he wanted to be influenced by Hemingway? That was the whole reason.
Right.
He was hoping to absorb the genius, right? I mean, that's what we're going for.
Very much. And I don't think anyone, these days learning that Hunter S. Thompson did that is like, oh yeah, like Hunter S. Thompson, he was just a Hemingway knockoff.
Yeah, so
like, I can see it now. Like, Hunter S. Thompson was an extremely unique, I mean, the guy pretty much founded gonzo journalism. Like, he had his own unique style and tone and voice, and getting influenced by someone that he really admired didn't at all change any of that. He was still able to be Hunter S. Thompson, maybe just like a little bit better version of Hunter S. Thompson that was more well-rounded than the original one that was, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegasing his way through life.
Well, when we're talking about Copywork, then we're talking about kind of forging a relationship with another author, someone you look up to maybe. Could you talk a bit about the role that feedback plays in interacting with other writers when developing your work?
Yeah, it's, I always tell people, one of the first questions people ask me about getting feedback from others is like, well, but when do I get feedback? When do I send a draft to someone? When do I get beta readers, that sort of thing? And my rule of thumb for that always is you send a draft to someone for feedback when you've thought yourself stupid. That is when you've written the draft and you've looked at it enough times, you've self-revised it enough times that you're looking at it and you're just thinking, I think I'm an idiot. I don't know like what else I can possibly do to this piece of paper. Like, you've exhausted kind of every mental addition that you can make to it. So that's when you then go and get a writing partner or an editor or a writing coach or even a writing community, if you're able to find one of those online that really resonates and is good for you. Always a really important thing, like make sure you find an editor or coach or community or whatever that resonates and is good for you, not just one that everyone else recommends, because it's like dating. Just because like everyone likes to date like that guy or that girl doesn't mean that that's the best person for you to date. It's very very similar. You want to find someone that you have a great relationship with. Writing partner that just really has the same work ethic, the same drive, the same values, the same approach to writing, but a lot of different experience and nuance and tone to be able to help you see the things that you're not able to see yourself in your writing, because you are human and you live inside your own head, and the writing came from inside your own head. So that's a lot of things swirling around up there.
Well, let's talk about that then. This idea, the writer who said, I would never do copy work because I need to isolate myself from influence. I need to be alone, just staring into the void. Because I know you have some specific thoughts on this concept, right? That it's actually quite a dangerous thing, this image of the isolated writer.
It's one of my like scariest and worst beautiful poetic writing kind of stereotypes, because I think that so many of us do get into that and believe that we should, all be this writer who's like just chugging whiskey and like locked in a room, chain smoking over drafts and drafts and drafts, just trying to belt it out. And the unfortunate thing is there's a very long history of writers who have done that. And so that's kind of how it's become ensconced into our culture and our society as writers. But even just saying that description out loud, and that's kind of a worst case scenario, obviously, but like you can just hear how unhealthy and damaging that is for a person. So we look at something like that and we think, oh, that's worst case scenario. Well, I haven't, really spent time with my family in 4 or 5 days because I've been working on this, but like, at least I'm not chain smoking and drinking behind a door. Like I'm still there-ish. But at that point in time, you've started losing that interaction, that humanity, that, connection and kind of support and community that you have created that gives you the will to go on writing. It's a really dangerous, there's study after study that proves that mental health and mental wellness issues are just so high in the creative communities, because we do believe that we should just internalize and not take care of ourselves and isolate ourselves from everyone when we're working on our craft and our project. And it's so scary and damaging to not take care of yourself and to not seek out the happiness and support that comes from being around others who can love you. And quite honestly, like the writing that you're able to do when you're in a happy and good place, it might not be the wonderful angsty stuff that you were able to produce when you were in that really dark place, but it's a different kind of writing that can still be as good and isn't as scary. And I full out use the term scary. Like that's, when people get depressive and get like suicidal and get things like that. And it's such a dangerous thing that we build it up to be this beautiful thing that creatives and writers should aspire to, because we're basically setting people up on a dangerous, dangerous road.
It's so interesting, this summit, I'm doing all these conversations and they always start with some minutia, like, let's talk about copywork. And they always end with like, you got to look inside, man. You got to get things worked out in here. And it's so fascinating, this relationship between craft and writing and this very practical element of it, but also like, writing is so emotional and it's so mental, and we've touched on even like brain science a little bit in this right? And none of these things are divorced from one another. They're all intermingling and working together.
It's it's kind of one of those, when you're creating and you're writing, you really are taking pieces of yourself, whether you're inserting yourself into the story or even if it's just your ideas that you're inserting into the story. Those are still pieces of you. They're your own little like mind babies that you've created and nurtured and are putting onto a page and out to the world. And so like, of course, when you're putting yourself out there in that way, you want to like wholly devote yourself to making sure that that's great, that perfectionism, that stuff that we were talking about. But it's just, yeah, I similarly, whenever I talk to writers and creatives, it almost always ends up in this place that we're talking and we're all like, yeah, but like, you got to take care of yourself. Otherwise you burn out. And that's, I think it's Chuck Wendig, who's an author, is very prominent on Twitter and has a great blog, Terrible Minds.
Mm-hmm.
He's written a blog post before that basically talks about, you know, what a lot of people might not realize is when you're experiencing writer's block and burnout, that might actually be like the flare up of some sort of like depression or some sort of extreme sadness. And it's not actually, you know, writer's block. It's not some, like you were saying, mechanical thing that you can work through. If it's a mechanical thing you can work through, then it is just simply writer's block and like, yay for you for getting on and writing more. But if you're just racking your brain day after day and not able to get out of that place where you can't create, like that's not writer's block. That's something that, you know, you definitely need to take some time and figure out like how to write yourself in your own ship to be able to get back to being the writer and the creative that you want to be.
Absolutely. When I think about copy work, I have this idea in my head where I'm like, okay, so where would I put this book and where would I put the paper, and you know, what book would I want to copy and how often would I want to do that? But I know you actually have a program that pulls all of this stuff together. So maybe you want to talk a bit about that for people who have watched this video and who have, you know, thought to themselves, wow, Copywork worked for Stephen King and Hunter S. Thompson and Elisa and Kevin. Who else can I? Maybe it can work for me.
Who can I figure it out from? Yeah, so basically because I've been writing for almost 20 years and been editing and coaching for 10 years, people were constantly asking me like, well, how do I get to be a writer like you? How do I, and it's kind of where you ask writers that and everyone starts getting the really annoying advice of like, well, you just have to sit down and write every day and read a lot and blah, blah, blah. And I think it's because most of us, that is how we learned to write, is just by trying again and again and again with the writing and doing a lot of reading and that sort of thing. So I basically went through, I spent probably, I would say, between like 200 and 300 hours, like going back, researching what some of the most kind of poignant and prolific books, essays, articles, that sort of thing have been in shaping my writing understanding. Beyond like, there's absolutely no like elements of style or any of the writing technical books. It is really all fiction books and philosophic essays and really, really great essays and articles and even some poetry and some song lyrics and things like that. And so what I did was basically then went back into the 56 that I determined. It's an 8-week course. So, and pulled out excerpts that really illustrated a particular point of writing style and influence or storytelling, so that then you can kind of take these excerpts that I've hand selected. So, because that's always the worst and the hardest part, is people tell you like, write more and read more, and you're like, awesome, but what?
Exactly.
I don't know what books to choose. I'm supposed to read. I don't know like what I'm supposed to be writing, as if there's a supposed to be, but and so we kind of just in the course break all of that down so that you get not only a lesson of like what you should pay attention to in that day's copywork excerpt assignment, but then also the copywork excerpt assignment. And then at the end of every week, there's kind of a little synopsis of like, here's what the overarching module this week was about. Here's like some of the different things we learned from all of the excerpts. Now here's a writing prompt for you. Like, go and free write on this writing prompt using what you've just learned from the past 5 days of copywork assignments. And so that's kind of, again, where that Miyagi comes in, that after a couple weeks, as soon as you go to do the free writing thing, you're like, oh, like actually, like you were saying, I do remember that thing that I read in the first week, or I think that that totally applies to this here. And so you can kind of really start learning. And the great news is I've spent 40 years of my life reading and learning and figuring all this stuff out for you, so you don't have to.
I love it. And the name of the course is?
The name of the course is Become a Master Writer, because it's basically a course that teaches you how to become a better writer by learning from master writers. So if you take the course, you should become a master writer at some point.
And Elisa, you've agreed to offer a discount to all the folks attending the summit. So they'll see a link or a code below this video, and they'll be able to use that to get a discount to join the course.
Yeah, this is a great thing you're doing. And I love everyone who's watching and listening being so dedicated that they would hang out and watch you and I talk on a video about like copywork and, you know, taking care, self-care for writers and everything else. So as a little reward to you all for getting to the end of this, click that link down there and you can get a nice discount and come over and join us and become a master writer.
Elisa, thank you so much for taking the time to join me on the summit today. I love your passion for copywork, and I know all the thought you've given to it. And so it was great to get you on here and let people know about this very specific practice that they can institute in their lives to become a better writer.
Absolutely.